The world we live on is mostly water, and for almost all of human history, that water was the greatest mystery our species ever faced. Before anyone drew a reliable map, before anyone understood what lay beneath the waves or beyond the horizon, people climbed into fragile vessels made of wood and rope and animal hide, and they pushed themselves into the unknown. They did not have engines. They did not have radios. They did not have any guarantee that the wind would carry them where they needed to go or that the sea would let them come home. Every single departure from shore was a gamble with the planet itself, a quiet bet placed against currents and storms and distances so vast they could swallow entire fleets without leaving a trace. And yet, they went. They always went. Something inside the human mind refuses to stay on shore when there is water stretching out to the edge of sight, whispering that there might be something extraordinary just beyond the place where the sky meets the sea. This is a story that stretches across thousands of years and touches every coastline on Earth. It is the story of ocean expeditions, of the ships that ventured out and the people who sailed them, of the knowledge they carried home and the prices they paid for it. It is a story of courage that sometimes looked like madness, of patience that sometimes looked like suffering, and of curiosity that simply refused to die no matter how many times the ocean tried to drown it. These voyages shaped the maps we use today. They connected continents that had no idea the others existed. They carried languages, religions, diseases, and ideas from one side of the planet to the other, and they changed the course of history in ways that are still unfolding right now. In this very moment, as cargo ships cross the same waters and submarines glide through the same depths that once terrified the bravest sailors alive. Ocean expeditions mapped most of the world before any airplane ever left the ground. For the vast majority of recorded history, the fastest and most reliable way to learn what lay beyond the horizon was to point the bow of a ship straight at it and sail until you found out. There was no aerial photography, no satellite imagery, no drone footage streaming back to a comfortable office on land. There was only the ship, the crew, the wind, and whatever the sea decided to reveal. Mariners traced coastlines by watching the color of the water change beneath their hulls, by studying the shape of clouds that gathered above unseen islands, and by catching the faint smell of vegetation carried on a breeze that had crossed land before reaching them. They sketched bays and headlands and rocky shoals into rough notebooks, and then they returned years later to correct a curve that had been drawn too hastily or to add a reef that had nearly killed them the first time through. These voyages stitched together the continents long before flight, made distance feel small and manageable. Every chart that survived was a piece of hard-won knowledge, paid for in sweat and seasickness, and sometimes in lives. Charts turned blank spaces on parchment into routes, and routes turned into trade, and trade turned into migration, and migration turned into conflict, and conflict turned into empires that rose and fell according to how well they understood the waters around them. Port cities became crossroads where dozens of languages mixed in the same marketplace, and where ideas traveled just as quickly as cargo, sometimes faster, because an idea does not need to be loaded onto a cart or weighed at a customs house. It simply passes from one mind to another over a shared meal or a shouted conversation on a crowded dock. Even mistakes mattered enormously. A misplaced island on a chart could lure ships into danger, sending them confidently toward a position where rocks waited just below the surface. A newly confirmed strait, on the other hand, could redraw the political map of an entire region, because a passage between two bodies of water meant faster travel, cheaper trade, and a strategic advantage that rival nations would fight to control. The world we picture when we close our eyes and imagine a globe, that familiar shape with its continents and oceans arranged just so, was earned the slow way, one perilous shoreline at a time, by people who had no idea what the finished picture would look like. To understand how ocean exploration began, we have to go back to the ancient world, to a time when the Mediterranean Sea was the center of everything that mattered to the civilizations clustered around its shores. The Mediterranean is not a small body of water by any means, but compared to the open Atlantic or the vast Pacific, it is almost intimate. Its coastlines are never impossibly far apart. Its islands are numerous enough to serve as stepping stones, and its weather, while certainly capable of killing, follows patterns that observant sailors could learn to predict with reasonable accuracy. It was the perfect classroom for a species that was just beginning to figure out what the ocean could offer and what it could take away. The ancient Greeks were among the first people to treat geography not merely as a collection of stories handed down from travelers, but as a problem that could be investigated, tested, and argued about with something approaching intellectual rigor. Greek thinkers wanted to know the shape of the world, and they were not content to simply accept whatever the last sailor who stumbled into port happened to say about it. They gathered reports from merchants and military commanders and fishermen. They compared distances and coast shapes and descriptions of currents, and then they sat down and tried to assemble all of those scraps into a coherent picture that made logical sense. Some of them attempted early measurements of the Earth itself, using the angles of shadows cast by the sun at different locations to reason about the planet's overall size and curvature, an achievement that still feels remarkable when you consider the tools they had available. Others debated endlessly about what might lie beyond the known waters. Was the ocean a boundary, a wall of water marking the edge of the habitable world? Or was it a highway, a vast road that connected lands no Greek had ever visited to the familiar shores of home? These arguments were not idle philosophy conducted by comfortable men with nothing better to do. They shaped real decisions that affected real lives. A captain choosing a route for a trading voyage needed practical guidance about what he might encounter, and a city-state planning its commercial strategy needed believable maps that reflected the actual layout of harbors, islands, and coastlines. The tension between careful observation and bold speculation became part of the culture of exploration itself, a creative friction that pushed knowledge forward even when individual claims turned out to be wrong. Not every theory survived contact with reality, and the Greeks were sometimes spectacularly mistaken about the details. But the method they championed was powerful and enduring. Ask a question, gather whatever evidence you can find, build the best answer you can from that evidence, and then accept, with as much grace as you can manage, that the sea might prove you wrong the next time someone sails out to check. That mindset, more than any single voyage or any single map, helped keep horizons moving outward. It planted the idea that the unknown was not something to be feared or ignored, but something to be investigated, and that the investigation itself was a worthy use of human effort and intelligence. While the Greeks were debating the shape of the world from their academies and harbor towns, another civilization was quietly building one of the most impressive maritime networks the ancient world had ever seen. The Phoenicians were not philosophers in the traditional sense. They were traders, craftsmen, and sailors whose genius lay not in abstract reasoning, but in practical action. Their world was stitched together by harbors, islands, and the sharp headlands that demanded constant attention from anyone navigating the eastern Mediterranean. They carried goods that people wanted desperately, including metals like tin and copper, beautifully worked glass, and the famous purple dye that took enormous amounts of labor and vast quantities of sea snails to produce. That dye was so valuable and so closely associated with Phoenician identity that it became almost synonymous with wealth and power in the ancient world. But their most lasting cargo was something far smaller than any amphora of wine or bolt of dyed cloth. The Phoenicians developed and spread a practical writing system, an alphabet that made record-keeping faster, commercial deals clearer, and messages easier to copy and transmit across distances. This was not a luxury. It was a tool, as essential to their trading network as a strong hull or a reliable anchor. And as their ships moved from port to port, carrying timber and textiles and metalwork, sailors and merchants shared not only products but habits, words, and ways of counting and recording value. Over time, letters traveled farther than the sailors who first scratched them onto clay tablets and potsherds. A symbol carved in one coastal town could reappear in another, shaped by new tongues and adapted to new needs, evolving as it moved until it became the ancestor of writing systems used by billions of people today. Ocean routes became learning routes. Commerce and communication grew together, feeding each other in a cycle that accelerated with every successful voyage. The Phoenicians demonstrated something that would be proven again and again throughout the history of ocean exploration. The sea does not just carry physical cargo. It carries ideas, and ideas, once released into the world, have a way of traveling farther and lasting longer than anyone who first conceived them could possibly have imagined. An entire system of written communication, one of the most transformative inventions in human history, was spread across the ancient world partly because sailors needed a better way to keep track of their business, and the sea gave them the network to share it. Far from the Mediterranean, on the other side of the world, a completely different tradition of ocean navigation was developing, one that did not rely on written charts or magnetic compasses or any of the instruments that would later become standard equipment on European vessels. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, long before modern instruments existed, expert wayfinders were treating the open sea like a readable landscape, a place full of signs and signals that could guide a skilled navigator across thousands of miles of open water with no land in sight for weeks at a time. These were the Polynesian navigators, and their achievements remain among the most extraordinary in the entire history of human exploration. They memorized star paths, the precise points on the horizon where specific stars rose and set in reliable patterns throughout the year, and they paired those celestial markers with the feel of ocean swells passing beneath their canoes. This was not a vague sense of direction. It was a refined and systematic body of knowledge, accumulated over generations and passed down through intensive apprenticeship. Different wave trains generated by distant storms or reflected off unseen islands would intersect beneath a canoe, and trained navigators could sense that crossing through the movement of the hull, like reading a hidden compass written in the motion of the water itself. It required extraordinary sensitivity, the kind that comes only from years of practice and a deep, almost physical intimacy with the ocean. Birds became clues as well. Certain species fly out from land to feed at dawn and return toward their nesting islands by evening, which means that a navigator who spots those birds in the late afternoon knows that land lies in the direction the birds are heading, even if that land is still far beyond the visible horizon. Clouds help too. Over shallow lagoons and low-lying islands, sunlight reflecting off turquoise water can brighten the underside of cloud decks in a way that open ocean cannot replicate, creating a faint glow that an experienced eye can detect from a remarkable distance. Even the color and texture of the sea surface carried information, shifting subtly as water depth changed or as currents flowing around a submerged landmass created distinctive patterns. Navigation for these voyagers was never guesswork. It was an accumulated science, as rigorous in its own way as anything practiced in the observatories of Europe, carried not in books and instruments but in stories, chants, and the living memory of master navigators who spent their entire lives learning to read the ocean. When Polynesian crews reached a tiny speck of land in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, an island so small it would be nearly invisible on a modern map, they proved something profound about the human capacity for knowledge. Human understanding can be portable, precise, and brave enough to cross vast emptiness without any of the technological advantages that later civilizations would take for granted. The Pacific was not a barrier to these people. It was a highway, and they knew every lane. While Polynesian navigators were crossing the Pacific using stars and swells, another seafaring culture was pushing the boundaries of the known world in the cold, storm-battered waters of the North Atlantic. The Norse sailors of Scandinavia built ships that were engineering marvels, vessels that were light enough to be fast, flexible enough to survive the punishing seas of the Northern Ocean, and shallow drafted enough to slip into rivers and estuaries, which meant that exploration did not have to stop at the shoreline. A Viking longship could cross open ocean one week and navigate a winding river the next, giving Norse explorers a versatility that few other maritime cultures could match. From their homelands in present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Norse sailors pushed westward across the Atlantic in a series of bold steps, each one building on the last. First they reached Iceland, a volcanic island sitting in the middle of the North Atlantic, and they established settlements there that endured despite the harsh climate and the island's remoteness. Then they pushed farther, to Greenland, where the conditions were even more demanding but where a determined community managed to sustain itself for centuries. And then, incredibly, they went farther still, reaching the coast of North America at a site now known as L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, where archaeological evidence confirms a Norse presence long before any of the later European voyages that would receive so much more historical attention. That reach was not magic, and it was not luck. It was seamanship of the highest order, combined with careful timing and a willingness to travel with only uncertain reports and second-hand descriptions as a guide. Norse sailors read the ocean the way their Polynesian counterparts did, watching for birds, reading wave patterns, and using the position of the sun when it was visible. Some researchers have even suggested that they may have used certain crystals, sometimes called sunstones, to help determine the sun's position on overcast days by exploiting the way those crystals interact with polarized light, though the evidence for this practice remains debated and tangled with legend. Whether or not sunstones were common tools or rare curiosities, the very idea points to something true about long-distance navigation. Mariners will test anything, absolutely anything, that might reduce the terrifying uncertainty of being far from land with no clear way to fix their position. These Norse journeys show how exploration can happen in steps, with each new settlement becoming a launching point for the next leap into the unknown. They also remind us that the concept of being first depends entirely on which story you were taught and whose perspective you are willing to consider. The Atlantic Ocean was crossed and crossed again, in both directions, long before it became a famous headline in European history books. The Norse did not think of themselves as making history. They were looking for land, for resources, for opportunities, and they followed the ocean wherever it seemed to lead. That practical, almost matter-of-fact approach to exploration is one of the things that makes their story so compelling. They did not wait for royal commissions or scientific theories. They simply built good ships, gathered brave crews, and sailed. Now let us turn our attention to the other end of the ancient world, to the civilization that built some of the most iconic monuments in human history, but is not always remembered for its maritime achievements. The ancient Egyptians sailed the Red Sea in search of incense and rare woods, and these voyages were not casual coastal hops undertaken by fishermen with time on their hands. They were organized, state-sponsored expeditions that required careful planning, significant resources, and a willingness to face genuine danger. Crews moved through intense heat, navigated treacherous reefs, and contended with sudden winds that could grind a wooden ship into splinters against a rocky shore. The Red Sea is a narrow body of water, but it is far from gentle, and the coastlines on both sides offered few safe harbors for a vessel in trouble. The goal of these voyages was treasure you could smell and touch. Resins and incense burned in the great temples of Egypt, timbers that could not be found anywhere along the Nile, and exotic materials that made royal ceremonies feel connected to far horizons and distant, almost mythical lands. The most famous of these expeditions was the voyage to the land of Punt, a trading destination whose exact location is still debated by historians, but which was clearly reached by sea and which provided Egypt with goods that were considered sacred and irreplaceable. Getting to the water could be as difficult as the sailing itself. Supplies had to be gathered from across the kingdom, hulls had to be constructed or assembled near the coast, and departures had to be timed to match the seasons that would make a return voyage possible, because the Red Sea's winds are not kind to ships that try to fight them at the wrong time of year. When an expedition came home loaded with incense trees, exotic animals, and precious materials, it proved that careful planning could stretch Egyptian ambition beyond the desert borders and out onto open water. It also proved something more fundamental about the nature of exploration. The desire to explore does not always begin with a craving for glory or a thirst for conquest. Sometimes it begins with something much simpler and more human. A craving for sacred scent, for strong wood that could not be found at home, for materials that made life richer and ceremonies more meaningful. That was enough to pull ships into the unknown, and it has been enough, in various forms, ever since. The Roman Empire took the connection between the sea and survival to an entirely different scale. A great city can be conquered without any army ever approaching its walls if its food supply stops arriving. And Roman power depended on massive shipments of grain crossing open water, especially from Egypt and North Africa, to feed a population that local harvests could not sustain. Ships became floating lifelines, carrying the calories that kept the empire's capital functioning and its population calm. When the seas were calm and the convoys ran on schedule, the system looked unstoppable, a marvel of organization and logistics that moved thousands of tons of grain across the Mediterranean with remarkable regularity. When the weather turned, it became frighteningly fragile. A delayed convoy could mean hunger in the streets, and hunger in the streets of Rome could mean political unrest that spread faster than any rumor, threatening the stability of the government itself. A series of wrecked grain ships could topple a political career or even destabilize an emperor's grip on power. This is one reason Rome invested so heavily in ports, warehouses, naval protection, and the infrastructure needed to keep the supply lines functioning. Captains who sailed the grain routes studied seasonal weather patterns with almost religious seriousness, because getting the timing wrong was not just a commercial inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe with consequences that rippled all the way to the imperial palace. The sea was both road and threat. It could deliver abundance in quantities that no overland caravan could match, and it could erase that abundance overnight with a single storm. Ocean expeditions in this era were not always about discovery or the thrill of reaching new lands. They were about keeping daily life alive at an imperial scale, about maintaining the fragile connection between a city and its food supply across miles of unpredictable water. Every successful crossing was a quiet victory that most people never thought about. Every wreck was a reminder that nature still held the upper hand, no matter how impressive the engineering or how confident the planning. In the Indian Ocean, an entirely different rhythm of maritime life was unfolding, one governed not by imperial decree but by the steady, predictable breathing of the monsoon winds. Arab and Swahili sailors learned to read those winds the way a musician reads a score, timing their voyages to match the seasonal shifts that could carry them outward across vast distances and then, months later, pull them home again. The monsoon patterns shift direction with the seasons, blowing from one quarter for half the year and then reversing, which means a voyage across the Indian Ocean was planned like a promise made to the sky. You departed when the winds were right, conducted your business in distant ports, and then waited for the winds to change before making the return journey. If you missed your window, you waited another season, because fighting the monsoon was a fool's errand that could cost you your ship and your life. This seasonal rhythm created a remarkably stable web of trade and travel linking East Africa, Arabia, India, and the lands beyond. Ports along these routes became multilingual meeting places where ivory, gold, spices, textiles, and dozens of other commodities changed hands alongside stories, religious ideas, and cultural practices. The Swahili city-states of the East African coast grew wealthy and cosmopolitan, their architecture and cuisine reflecting the diverse influences that arrived with every trading season. Arab merchants carried goods and knowledge across waters they knew intimately, building relationships with trading partners that could span generations. Navigators in the Indian Ocean built knowledge that was practical, repeatable, and shared across families and communities over centuries. The ocean was not a blank, terrifying space to be feared and avoided. It was a timed corridor, a predictable pathway that rewarded patience, careful observation, and good timing while punishing impatience and poor judgment. When you understand the winds, truly understand them in the way that comes only from years of experience and accumulated tradition, the distance between continents shrinks dramatically. What looks like a barrier from the shore becomes a bridge that opens and closes and opens again with the regularity of the seasons. The Indian Ocean Trade Network was one of the oldest and most sophisticated maritime systems in the world, and it flourished for centuries without the navigational instruments that European sailors would later consider essential. While these trading networks were crisscrossing the Indian Ocean, on the other side of Asia, the Chinese were developing a technology that would eventually transform navigation everywhere. Chinese sailors refined the magnetic compass and then trusted it on seas where clouds hid the stars and land was nowhere to be seen. A compass seems like a simple thing, a needle that points north, until you imagine relying on it when the sky is a featureless gray dome and the water stretches to the horizon in every direction without a single landmark to confirm your position. The shift from coastal navigation, where you could always see a familiar headland or follow a known shoreline, to true open water navigation, where your only guide was an instrument pointing steadily while the world around you moved unpredictably, required an entirely new kind of trust. You had to believe in the compass more than you believed in your own instincts, and that was not easy for sailors who had spent their entire careers navigating by sight. Chinese mariners helped develop and apply magnetic direction-finding technology, then used it to hold course when visibility failed and conventional navigation became impossible. That reliability changed what a voyage could be. Ships could aim for distant targets with fewer intermediate stops, and merchants could plan routes that were not chained to the side of shore. A vessel no longer had to creep along a coastline, trading speed for safety. It could strike out across open water with confidence that it would arrive somewhere close to its intended destination, even if the stars were hidden for days at a time. The compass also changed the dynamics of decision-making on board a ship. It gave captains a steady reference point when arguments arose about which direction to steer, when fear set in during a storm and panicked crew members wanted to turn back, or when confusion scattered everyone's sense of bearing after a night of heavy weather. Ocean expeditions often hinge on tiny inventions that make vast spaces manageable, and the compass is perhaps the best example of this principle. A small pointer, floating in a bowl of water or pivoting on a pin, barely larger than a finger, can become the difference between drifting in hopeless circles and arriving weeks later exactly where you intended to be. In the early 15th century, China launched a series of maritime expeditions that dwarfed anything the European powers of the time could have imagined. Under Admiral Zheng He, the Ming Dynasty sent vast, state-sponsored fleets across the seas of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, visiting ports where merchants already traded spices, textiles, and precious goods. These were not small ventures. The fleets carried soldiers, interpreters, craftspeople, and diplomats, along with cargo specifically chosen to impress and overawe the rulers of distant lands. Some historical accounts describe ships of enormous size, vessels that would have been among the largest wooden ships ever built, though the exact dimensions remain debated among historians. These expeditions were about power as much as they were about discovery. A large fleet arriving in a foreign harbor could settle disputes between local rulers, secure diplomatic alliances, and broadcast the authority and prestige of the Chinese emperor without firing a single shot. Gifts flowed outward from the fleet, demonstrations of Chinese wealth and sophistication, and tribute flowed back, acknowledging the emperor's position at the center of a vast network of relationships. It was political theater conducted on the water, and it was extraordinarily effective. The sheer scale of the enterprise startled everyone who witnessed it, and the stories that grew up around Zheng He's voyages became part history and part legend, growing larger and more dramatic with each retelling. Even without perfect measurements of every ship and every cargo, the message is unmistakable. Ocean exploration was never solely a European project. Great maritime states rose in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands, and they used the sea as a stage for diplomacy, strategy, cultural exchange, and the projection of power. The story of ocean expeditions is not a story with a single hero or a single starting point. It is a story with many beginnings, many traditions, and many different reasons for pushing a ship away from the safety of the shore. Now let us talk about the tools themselves, the instruments that made long-distance navigation possible and that transformed the ocean from an incomprehensible wilderness into something that could be measured, mapped, and eventually mastered. Every one of these tools has a story behind it, and every story involves someone standing on a moving deck, surrounded by water, trying to figure out where in the world they were. The astrolabe was one of the earliest instruments to give sailors a way to measure their position with something approaching precision. It allowed a mariner to measure the angle of a familiar star or of the sun at its highest point, above the horizon, and then translate that angle into a latitude, a north-south position on the face of the earth. It did not solve every navigational problem, and rough seas could turn a careful reading into a wild guess, because holding a delicate instrument steady on a pitching deck is far harder than it sounds. But it changed the mental map of a voyage in a profound way. A ship equipped with an astrolabe could know, with reasonable confidence, how far north or south it had wandered from its intended course, which made return routes safer and long open ocean crossings more confident. The astrolabe also gave exploration a new kind of discipline. Observation became a routine task, repeated night after night and noon after noon, with results carefully recorded and compared to previous readings. That rhythm turned the sky into a partner in navigation, a reliable reference point in a world where everything else, the wind, the waves, the currents, was constantly shifting. When you can measure where you are on a north-south line, the ocean stops being pure uncertainty. It becomes a grid that you can enter deliberately, with a plan and a destination, rather than a trackless void where every direction looks the same. For sailors who had spent their careers navigating by instinct and dead reckoning, that shift was nothing short of thrilling. It meant the heavens could guide you across water that offered no landmarks at all. The cross staff was another tool that helped sailors measure the angle between celestial bodies and the horizon, and it was both brilliantly simple in its design and brutal in its daily use. A sailor held the staff up to the side of the face and slid a crosspiece along it until one end lined up with the horizon and the other with the sun or a star, then read the angle from markings carved into the shaft. Used at night with stars, the process could be manageable, though still demanding on a moving ship. Used with the sun during the day, it was actively hazardous. Staring in the general direction of bright sunlight for the repeated readings necessary to get a reliable measurement could damage a sailor's eyesight, and many navigators paid for their accuracy with pain, irritation, and the gradual deterioration of their vision over years of service. Yet crews kept using the cross staff because the alternative was worse. Knowledge at sea has a price, but ignorance costs far more. A navigator who refused to take a sun sight because it hurt his eyes was a navigator who did not know his latitude. And a ship that did not know its latitude was a ship that could miss its landfall by hundreds of miles and sail on into empty ocean until the water ran out. The cross staff represents the gritty, uncomfortable reality that lies behind the elegant stories of navigation and discovery. Instruments were not magic talismans that automatically revealed the ship's position. They were crude, demanding tools that required steady hands, clear skies, and human bodies willing to endure discomfort and risk for the sake of a better position line. This is the true texture of expedition history, the part that gets left out of the grand narratives about courageous captains and glorious discoveries. The grand arc of discovery is built from thousands of small, uncomfortable moments where someone squinted into glare because they knew that a single degree of error in their latitude could mean missing an island by dozens of miles and condemning the entire crew to a long, potentially fatal drift through open water. Navigation was not glamorous. It was painstaking, physically demanding, and absolutely essential, and the people who practiced it deserved far more credit than they usually receive. But even with the astrolabe and the cross staff and the compass, there remained one navigational problem that defied solution for centuries, and that killed more sailors than almost any other single factor in the history of ocean exploration. That problem was longitude, the east-west position of a ship on the surface of the Earth. Knowing your latitude could keep you from drifting toward a hostile coast or wandering into freezing waters where you did not belong. But knowing your longitude could keep you from vanishing entirely, from sailing past your destination without ever knowing it was there, from striking a reef that your charts placed hundreds of miles away. For centuries, sailors could estimate their east-west position only loosely, using dead reckoning and rough calculations based on estimated speed and elapsed time. And small errors in those estimates grew into enormous dangers over the course of a long ocean crossing. A ship might believe it was safely offshore, with miles of open water between it and the nearest land, while in reality, reefs waited just ahead in the darkness, ready to tear the hull open and send everyone aboard to the bottom. This uncertainty turned navigation into anxious guesswork, and it made charts feel like promises that might break at any moment, no matter how carefully they had been drawn. Governments offered enormous rewards to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. Scientists argued endlessly about theoretical approaches, and captains kept sailing anyway, because commerce and war did not pause for unsolved mathematical problems, and the world's business still needed to cross the ocean whether navigators could fix their position or not. The heartbreak of the longitude problem is that the ocean punished honest mistakes just as savagely as it punished carelessness. Crews could do everything right, follow every procedure, take every observation, maintain perfect discipline, and still strike land that their best calculations placed days of sailing away. Good men died because the tools available to them were simply not precise enough to match the scale of the distances they were trying to cross. Solving longitude did not make the sea safe. Nothing could do that, but it made the sea legible. It turned the world's widest space into something you could measure with confidence, and that transformation, when it finally came, would change everything. But the solution to longitude would have to wait for a later chapter in our story. Before we get there, we need to talk about another form of navigational knowledge, one that did not come from instruments or mathematical theories, but from the accumulated practical experience of generations of working sailors. Medieval port-Oland charts captured coastlines with a startling degree of practical precision, and they did it without any of the theoretical framework that later cartographers would consider essential. These maps were built for use, not for decoration. They focused obsessively on coasts, harbors, and the angles between navigational landmarks, because those were the things that mattered when your ship was tired, your crew was hungry, and the shoreline ahead was dangerous and unfamiliar. Port-Oland charts featured dense webs of rum lines radiating from compass roses scattered across the map, helping navigators maintain headings from one port to another across open water. Their careful outlines of coastlines reflected knowledge accumulated through countless trips by countless sailors, each one contributing a small correction or a new observation to the growing picture. What makes these charts so striking to modern eyes is how accurate they can look in the regions that medieval sailors knew best. The Mediterranean coastlines on a good port-Oland chart can be remarkably recognizable, with bays, peninsulas, and islands placed in positions that feel almost modern. You can sense the hand of experience in every corrected curve and every carefully placed cape, the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors who risked their lives along those shores and brought their knowledge back to the chart makers. The charts also reveal priorities that tell us a great deal about the world that produced them. Inland regions are often vague, sketchy, or simply blank, because sailors did not need to know what lay behind the mountains. But the edge of the sea is sharp and confident, drawn with the care of people whose lives depended on getting it right. For expedition history, port-Oland charts mark a crucial turning point. Ocean travel was becoming systematic, shared, and repeatable. A captain setting out on a voyage no longer had to rely solely on his own memory or on second-hand rumors passed along in taverns. The map could carry collective knowledge forward from one generation to the next, and that accumulated wisdom helped widen the radius of where people dared to sail. As voyages reached farther from home and lasted longer, expedition leaders began to realize that discovery was not only about arriving at a new place. It was about returning with knowledge that could be shared, studied, and built upon. That realization led to one of the most important developments in the history of ocean exploration, the practice of carrying specialists alongside ordinary sailors. Early expeditions began to make room for naturalists, artists, and translators, people who did not steer the ship or reef the sails, but whose contributions would prove just as valuable as the work done by any able seaman. Naturalists collected specimens of plants and animals, sketched anatomical details, and noted behaviors that could not survive a long voyage preserved in a barrel of alcohol. Artists recorded coastlines, indigenous peoples, clothing, tools, and ceremonies with an immediacy and detail that written descriptions struggled to match. A skilled artist could capture in a single drawing what would take a writer pages to describe, and those drawings became invaluable records of places and peoples that might change dramatically or disappear entirely before anyone had a chance to visit again. Translators and interpreters made trade possible, reduced dangerous misunderstandings, and sometimes saved lives by catching a threatening situation before it escalated into violence. These mixed crews turned a ship into something much more than a vehicle for transportation. They transformed it into a moving research station and a diplomatic mission, a floating laboratory and an embassy combined. It also created tension, because cramped quarters on a wooden ship do not forgive differences easily, and the priorities of a naturalist eager to spend 3 days cataloging insects on a tropical island could clash violently with the priorities of a captain anxious to catch a favorable wind before it shifted. Still, the payoff was enormous. When a well-staffed expedition returned to its home port, it could change libraries, museums, and government policies, not just maps. Ocean expeditions became engines of culture as well as travel, and the knowledge they generated reshaped how entire civilizations understood the world around them. But the ocean was never just a path to knowledge and profit. It was also a hunting ground, and wherever wealth traveled in predictable patterns, predators learned to wait. Piracy followed shipping lanes like a shadow, and its presence forced fundamental changes in how nations organized their naval power. As trade routes hardened into habits, with ships following the same courses season after season, because those courses offered the best winds and the most reliable passages, pirates learned exactly where to position themselves for maximum advantage. They waited near straits, around islands, and in the busy approaches to major ports, places where merchant ships had to pass, and where the geography offered hiding places and escape routes. Their success depended on speed, intimidation, and a surprisingly detailed knowledge of tides, currents, and local geography. A good pirate captain needed to be a good navigator, because chasing down a prize and escaping from pursuit both required seamanship of a high order. Merchant crews often had little chance when they were caught. A pirate attack could strip cargo, seize an entire ship, or hold passengers and crew for ransom, all within minutes of the first warning. The economic impact was devastating, and it forced changes that reshaped maritime history for centuries. Nations began to fund stronger naval patrols to protect their commerce. They built better armed escort vessels and organized convoys that grouped merchant ships together under the protection of warships. Insurance markets grew as merchants sought financial protection against losses they could not prevent. Ports tightened rules about papers, manifests, and cargo inspections. Even ship design shifted, with builders producing faster vessels that could outrun trouble rather than standing and fighting. Piracy also created its own mythology, a romantic image of freedom and adventure that has persisted in popular culture for centuries. But the reality was far more practical and far more frightening than any storybook version. It was organized crime on the high seas, and it fed on the same global connections that made cities wealthy and empires powerful. The ocean became a chessboard where commerce and violence learned each other's moves, and neither could exist without the other. The ocean was shaping human civilization in ways that no one standing on shore could fully comprehend. Every voyage, every chart, every instrument, every battle, every trade route added another thread to a web of connections that was slowly drawing the world together. And we are still only at the beginning of the story. The great age of circumnavigation was about to begin, and with it, the human understanding of the planet would change forever. The ships that sailed in the centuries to come would carry not just cargo and crews, but ideas that would reshape science, politics, and the very way people understood their place in the universe. But before we follow those ships into the open Atlantic and beyond, let us pause for a moment and appreciate the enormity of what had already been accomplished. By the time the great European voyages of exploration began, human beings had already crossed the Pacific in canoes, navigated the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds, reached North America from Scandinavia, traded across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and developed tools and techniques for navigating open water that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. The story of ocean exploration is not a story that begins with Columbus or Magellan or any other single figure. It is a story that begins with the first person who looked at the water and decided to find out what was on the other side. And it has been continuing, without interruption, ever since. The ancient and medieval sailors who built this foundation did not think of themselves as making history. They were solving problems, earning livelihoods, serving their rulers, and satisfying a curiosity that seems to be wired into the human spirit at the deepest possible level. They deserve to be remembered not as primitive precursors to later, supposedly more sophisticated explorers, but as masters of their craft who accomplished extraordinary things with the tools and knowledge available to them. The Polynesian navigator who crossed 2,000 miles of open Pacific to reach a tiny island. The Phoenician merchant who carried an alphabet from port to port along with his cargo of purple dye. The Norse sailor who reached North America in a longship. The Chinese admiral who led fleets of unprecedented size across the Indian Ocean. These people were every bit as skilled, as brave, and as important as anyone who came after them. and their stories are part of the same great narrative that would eventually carry human beings to every corner of the ocean and, ultimately, to the deepest point on the planet itself. The tools they developed, the compass, the astrolabe, the cross staff, the portal on chart, were not just clever gadgets. They were expressions of a fundamental human need to reduce uncertainty, to impose order on chaos, to turn the terrifying randomness of the open ocean into something that could be understood, predicted, and navigated. Every one of those tools represented countless hours of trial and error, of failed experiments and dangerous mistakes, of observations made under conditions that would test the endurance of any human being. And every one of them brought the world a little closer together, making it possible for ships to travel farther, stay at sea longer, and return home more reliably than the generation before. The ocean had been humanity's greatest challenge and its greatest teacher. It had rewarded courage and punished carelessness. It had connected civilizations and destroyed fleets. It had carried languages and diseases and religious ideas from one end of the world to the other, and it had barely begun to reveal its secrets. The deepest waters were still unplumbed, the longest voyages were still unsailed, and the most important discoveries were still waiting, hidden beneath the surface or beyond the horizon, for someone brave enough or curious enough or desperate enough to go looking for them. The next chapter of this story will take us into the age of circumnavigation, when ships would circle the entire globe for the first time and prove that the oceans of the world were connected into one vast, continuous system. It will take us into the age of scientific exploration, when voyages would be planned not just for profit or conquest, but for knowledge itself, and when the observations made by a young naturalist on a survey ship would change how humanity understood its own place in the natural world. It will take us into the depths of the ocean, where pressure and darkness hide landscapes and life forms that no one had ever imagined, and where the simple act of dropping a weighted line straight down opened a new dimension of the planet. But all of that is still to come. For now, we are standing at the edge of the ancient world, looking out across water that stretches to the horizon and beyond, water that has already carried human beings farther than anyone thought possible, and that still holds mysteries enough to fill 1,000 lifetimes of exploration. The wind is picking up, the tide is turning, and somewhere, on some shore, someone is pushing a ship into the water and setting out to find what lies on the other side. They have always done this. They will always do this. It is what makes us human, this refusal to accept that the horizon is the end of the story, this stubborn, beautiful insistence that there is always something more to discover, something more to learn, something more to understand about the world we live on and the water that covers most of its surface. The story of ocean expeditions is the story of that insistence, played out across millennia and across every ocean on the planet. It is a story of genius and foolishness, of bravery and cruelty, of knowledge won at terrible cost and shared with extraordinary generosity. It is a story that belongs to every culture and every civilization that has ever built a boat and trusted it to the waves. And it is a story that is still being written, right now, by scientists and sailors and explorers who are carrying the same ancient curiosity into waters that still hold more questions than answers. Let the waves carry us forward. There is so much more to tell. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself with fanfare or dramatic speeches. It is the quiet, grinding courage of someone who has already been at sea for months, who has watched shipmates die from disease and violence and despair, who has eaten through the good provisions and started on the bad ones, and who still gets up every morning and does the work because turning back is no longer an option and because somewhere ahead, if the calculations are right and the winds cooperate and the ship holds together, there is a destination worth reaching. This is the courage that carried the first circumnavigation of the Earth to its conclusion, not in triumph exactly, but in a kind of battered, exhausted proof that the thing could be done at all. When Ferdinand Magellan's expedition set out from Spain in September of 1519, it carried with it a daring idea that most serious navigators of the era considered either visionary or suicidal, depending on their temperament. The idea was this: a ship could reach the same point it had left without ever touching the overland trade routes that connected Europe to Asia, without sailing around Africa and across the Indian Ocean in the way that Portuguese traders had been doing for years. Instead, it would go west. It would cross the Atlantic, find a passage through or around the landmass of South America, enter whatever ocean lay beyond, and sail across that unknown expanse until it reached the Spice Islands of Asia from the opposite direction. Then it would continue, completing the circle, returning to Spain from the west, having gone all the way around the world. The logic was elegant. The execution was a nightmare that lasted nearly 3 years and consumed almost everything and everyone involved in it. The 5 ships that departed Spain carried roughly 270 men, and by the time the single surviving vessel limped back into a Spanish harbor in September of 1522, it carried 18. Everything else, for ships and more than 250 lives, had been consumed by storms, starvation, disease, mutiny, violence, and the sheer crushing difficulty of attempting something that no human being had ever successfully accomplished. Magellan himself died in April of 1521, killed in a battle on the island of Mactan in what is now the Philippines, having sailed more than halfway around the world but never completing the circuit he had envisioned. The journey was not a triumphant parade. It was a grind. A long, brutal, unrelenting grind of storms and calms and shortages and tensions that turned crewmates into rivals and tested every form of human endurance that exists. Almost from the beginning, things went wrong in ways that compounded and multiplied. The passage through what is now called the Strait of Magellan, at the southern tip of South America, took 38 days of careful, terrifying navigation through a maze of channels and islands where the weather was savage and the margin for error was essentially zero. Crew members who had been recruited with promises of adventure and profit found themselves instead facing conditions that stripped away every illusion about the romance of exploration. One ship turned back early. Another was wrecked. A mutiny was suppressed with the kind of harsh measures that were standard for the era, but that deepened the atmosphere of fear and distrust that pervaded the expedition from its early weeks. When the fleet finally emerged from the strait and entered the Pacific Ocean, the name they gave it reflecting the unusually calm conditions they encountered at first, they had no reliable information about how large this ocean actually was. Magellan's estimate was catastrophically wrong. He thought the Pacific would take about 3 weeks to cross. It took nearly 4 months, and those months were among the most harrowing in the entire history of ocean exploration. The provisions ran out. The water stored in barrels turned foul and then ran critically low. Sailors began eating leather that had been softened by soaking in the sea, and rats, when they could be caught, became a valued food source rather than a pest. Scurvy tightened its grip on the crew with the slow, terrible patience that characterized this particular disease, swelling gums and reopening old wounds and turning ordinary movements into agony. Men died. Others became too weak to work properly, and the ships sailed on, day after day, through an ocean that seemed to have no end, because the calculations were wrong and the destination was farther than anyone had imagined. When the fleet finally reached islands where fresh food and water were available, the relief must have been almost overwhelming. But the expedition's ordeal was far from over. More violence, more disease, more decisions made under desperate conditions continued to thin the ranks. Magellan's death left the command fractured and the remaining ships in the hands of men who were capable, but who had to navigate not just the ocean but the complex, shifting politics of the Philippine archipelago while simultaneously managing an increasingly desperate crew. And yet, impossibly, it worked. Or at least part of it worked. One ship, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, made it back to Spain. 18 men, out of the 270 who had departed, completed the first circumnavigation of the Earth. The return was not a triumphant parade through cheering crowds. It was proof carved out of endurance, a demonstration achieved at devastating human cost that the world was indeed a sphere that could be circled by sea alone. The circumnavigation forced sailors and scholars to confront how huge the planet felt from deck level, where every day is measured in wind and water rather than in miles on a map. At sea, distance is not an abstraction. It is something you experience with your entire body, through the rolling of the deck, the ache of tired muscles, the monotony of unchanged horizon, and the slow countdown of diminishing supplies. Magellan's expedition revealed the practical truth that the oceans of the world connect into one continuous system, with passages that can be found and exploited if you can survive long enough to search for them. But it also revealed how brutal that system could be to those who entered it without adequate preparation, accurate information, or the kind of luck that does not depend on skill. The voyage changed how people imagined distance in ways that went far beyond cartography. It made the world feel both larger in hardship and smaller in possibility, demonstrating simultaneously that circumnavigation was achievable and that achieving it cost more than almost anyone had been willing to admit beforehand. It shifted global trade decisively toward the sea, because once the circuit had been proved possible, merchants and governments began to think in terms of ocean routes rather than overland paths, and the consequences of that shift would reshape empires and economies for centuries. But the circumnavigation of Magellan and Elcano, for all its significance, was a voyage of survival more than a voyage of systematic knowledge. The expedition gathered some geographical information and proved some theoretical points, but it did not produce the kind of careful, repeatable observations that would eventually transform ocean exploration from an act of courage into an act of science. That transformation required a different kind of expedition, led by a different kind of explorer, one who cared as much about accuracy and method as about arrival and survival. Captain James Cook earned his extraordinary reputation through a combination of navigational skill, methodical patience, and an approach to precision that was unusual for his era and remarkable in its practical consequences. Cook took his measurements seriously in a way that outlasted his time. He took repeated bearings whenever conditions allowed, checked his positions against multiple observations, and treated errors not as minor inconveniences to be brushed aside, but as debts that had to be repaid before he could move forward with confidence. The result was charts that helped later crews avoid reefs, find safe anchorages, and enter unfamiliar harbors with considerably fewer fatal surprises than they might otherwise have expected. His work mattered enormously because the Pacific Ocean is profoundly unforgiving of navigational error. Islands can be small, and a single misjudged mile can turn a confident approach into a long, desperate drift with dwindling supplies and no clear idea of where land might next appear. A chart that placed an island 5 miles from its actual position was not just inaccurate in an academic sense. It was dangerous in a very practical sense, because ships navigating by that chart would make decisions based on false information and might find themselves in serious trouble as a result. Cook understood this at a fundamental level, and it shaped everything about how he approached the work of surveying and mapping. Cook made 3 great voyages of exploration into the Pacific, and each one added significantly to the body of knowledge available to later navigators. His first voyage, from 1768 to 1771, carried him around Cape Horn, across to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus across the face of the sun, and then south and west in search of the great southern continent that many theorists believed must exist to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere. He charted the coasts of New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia with extraordinary care, producing maps that remained in use for generations. His second voyage, from 1772 to 1775, took him even farther south, crossing the Antarctic Circle 3 times and definitively disproving the existence of any large habitable southern continent, at least in the accessible latitudes. His third voyage, from 1776 to 1779, explored the North Pacific and the Arctic coast of North America in search of a northwest passage from the Pacific side. Cook's approach to the practical challenges of long-distance voyaging was as important as his navigational skill. He paid close attention to the health of his crew in ways that were well ahead of his time, insisting on dietary variety and cleanliness and ventilation that most commanders of the era would have considered unnecessary or impractical. The result was that his ships completed extraordinarily long voyages with remarkably low mortality from the diseases, particularly scurvy, that routinely devastated other expeditions. This was not just good luck. It was policy, carefully developed and consistently enforced. His charts sat at a fascinating and tense crossroads in history. They represent extraordinary skill and patient observation of the highest order, and they also became tools that opened doors for colonization. When a coastline is measured and named and charted with precision, it becomes easier to claim, easier to govern, and easier to exploit. The same line on paper could guide a ship safely into harbor and simultaneously become an instrument of political and cultural transformation for the people who had been living along that coastline for generations. Cook's legacy is therefore complicated, as the legacies of great explorers almost always are when we look at them honestly rather than through the lens of uncritical admiration. But let us follow one of Cook's most important voyages in more detail, because it carried aboard a passenger whose observations during the voyage would eventually change the way human beings understood their own place in the natural world. The HMS Beagle was not Captain Cook's ship. It was a smaller survey vessel that set out on its second voyage in 1831, more than half a century after Cook's death, carrying a young naturalist named Charles Darwin, who had been offered the position almost as an afterthought, a companion for the captain during the long, socially isolating stretches of a survey voyage. Darwin was 22 years old when the Beagle departed. He was seasick almost immediately and remained susceptible to seasickness throughout a voyage that would last nearly 5 years. He was also, as the voyage revealed, one of the most observant naturalists who had ever lived, with a capacity for making connections between disparate observations that would eventually produce one of the most consequential intellectual frameworks in the history of science. The Beagle's mission was to survey the coastlines of South America, and it did this work carefully and thoroughly, charting harbors and measuring depths and mapping coastlines in the Cook tradition. But for Darwin, the ship was a vehicle for something else entirely. Every port call, every stretch of coastline, every island and forest and rocky shore was an opportunity to observe, collect, measure, and record the natural world in its extraordinary variety. During years at sea and on shore, Darwin compared creatures and landscapes across distances that no naturalist working from a single location could have managed. He saw patterns that felt too consistent to be explained by coincidence. Similar animals appeared on different islands with small but consistent differences, as if each population had been shaped by the specific conditions of its particular environment rather than by a single divine template applied uniformly across the whole of creation. Fossils hinted that past worlds had held different forms of life, that species had appeared and disappeared in ways that suggested change over time rather than a fixed, unchanging creation. Living species seemed to be connected to each other and to extinct forms in ways that conventional thinking at the time had not fully reckoned with. The voyage did not hand Darwin a finished theory. It gave him a collection of observations and a set of questions that simply would not let go, that followed him back to England and occupied him for decades of careful, painstaking research before he was willing to present his conclusions to the world. What the time at sea gave him, perhaps as importantly as any specific observation, was something rare and precious. Long stretches of enforced leisure in which to think, to revisit his notes, to weigh the evidence he had gathered against the beliefs he had grown up with, to ask himself honestly which was stronger. The Beagle voyage is one of the most dramatic examples in the history of ocean exploration of how a voyage undertaken for one purpose can end up producing consequences in an entirely different domain. The ship went out to measure coastlines. It came back with a naturalist who had begun to glimpse the mechanism that connects all living things. When Darwin's ideas eventually reached the public in 1859, nearly a quarter century after the Beagle returned to England, they challenged the deepest assumptions about nature, about time, about the relationship between species, and about humanity's place in the natural world. One expedition for mapping coastlines ended up mapping a new way of thinking about life itself, and the ripples spread far beyond any harbor. The great age of scientific ocean exploration reached its most systematic expression in the middle of the 19th century, when the HMS Challenger set out on a mission that sounds almost impossibly ambitious even by modern standards. Measure the ocean. Sample it systematically. Describe it comprehensively. And do this not just in one region or one basin, but across the entire globe. The Challenger expedition, which ran from 1872 to 1876, was the first truly global oceanographic survey, and it founded the discipline of oceanography as a modern science. The crew lowered weighted lines for depth measurements at hundreds of stations across every major ocean. They hauled up sediment samples from the seafloor and water samples from different depths, preserving them carefully for later analysis. They collected specimens of marine life from places no human being had ever physically visited, using nets and dredges to bring up creatures from depths where the pressure would have killed any unprotected person instantly. Everything was cataloged, preserved, and shipped back to be studied by specialists on shore. The work was slow, relentless, and often physically demanding, requiring patience, coordination, and the willingness to repeat the same careful procedures in rough weather as in calm. What made the Challenger voyage revolutionary was not just what it discovered, though the discoveries were genuinely remarkable. What made it revolutionary was its intent. For the first time, the sea was being treated systematically as something that could be investigated with consistent methods, repeatable procedures, and rigorous record-keeping, rather than as a collection of anecdotes gathered by whoever happened to be passing through. The Challenger's results, published in a series of volumes that filled a small library, shaped the language and the conceptual framework of oceanography for generations. Depth, temperature, chemistry, and life were linked together into one coherent story about a connected global system rather than treated as separate curiosities. The expedition also changed expectations in a fundamental way. After the Challenger returned, the ocean was no longer just a route to somewhere else, a means of transportation between more interesting destinations. It became a subject worth exploring for its own sake, a place with mysteries that demanded careful measurement and patient investigation rather than just bold navigation. The deep sea had a geography, it had a chemistry, it had a biology, and understanding those things mattered, not just for scientific reasons, but for practical ones, because everything that happened in the ocean eventually affected the world above and around it. The Challenger found that the ocean was, in certain places, far deeper than anyone had imagined. For a long time, many people had pictured the seafloor as a relatively nearby bottom, something that a strong rope could reach without extraordinary effort. That comfortable picture began to crumble as early deep soundings were made by earlier expeditions, but the Challenger confirmed and systematized the truth in a way that could not be ignored. Crews lowered weighted lines until the cord ran out into darkness, and the waiting grew long enough to feel genuinely unreal. When the line finally came back, it carried a number that made everyone on board stare at each other in silence. The ocean was not a shallow basin. It was a vast vertical world, with depths that exceeded the height of the highest mountains on land. That discovery changed everything it touched. It affected where ships could safely anchor, how submarine telegraph cables might be laid across ocean floors, and whether anyone could ever hope to reach the deepest places. It also shifted human imagination in ways that went beyond the purely practical. If the sea had such depth, then it might hide landscapes of extraordinary complexity, mountains and valleys and plains that no human eye had ever seen. It might hold life adapted to pressure and darkness and cold in ways that challenged every existing understanding of what living things required to survive. A simple act, dropping a weighted line straight down into the water, had opened a new dimension of the earth. Exploration was no longer only horizontal, a matter of sailing across the surface. It had become a descent, a journey into an unseen planet that existed within the one everyone thought they already knew. Now, let us return to one of the most elegant and tormenting problems in the history of navigation, the problem of longitude, because its solution is one of the great stories in the history of technology and human ingenuity, and it changed the course of ocean exploration more profoundly than almost any other single development. Knowing latitude, knowing how far north or south you were, was achievable with the instruments that existed by the 16th century. Difficult, demanding work, but achievable. The astrolabe, the cross staff, and later the sextant could all give a careful navigator a reasonably accurate latitude measurement, especially at noon when the sun reached its highest point, and a single careful observation could fix the ship's north-south position with confidence. But longitude, the east-west position, was a different problem entirely, and it defeated the best mathematical and astronomical minds in Europe for more than 2 centuries. The fundamental difficulty was this. The Earth rotates, completing a full turn every 24 hours, which means that the sun appears to move across the sky at a steady rate. Every hour, the sun moves 15 degrees of longitude across the sky, which means that if you could compare the local time at your current position, measured by observing when the sun reaches its highest point, with the time at a fixed reference point, say a home port whose longitude you know, You could calculate how many hours of difference exist between the two. Multiply those hours by 15 degrees, and you have your longitude. The math is simple. The challenge was keeping accurate time at sea. On land, pendulum clocks could keep excellent time for years. At sea, the rolling and pitching of a ship interfered with any pendulum mechanism, making it useless. Salt air corroded delicate mechanisms. Temperature changes caused metals to expand and contract, throwing off the rate of any clock. The constant vibration of a ship under sail or in heavy weather shook delicate parts loose or altered their calibration in ways that accumulated into significant errors over weeks and months. A clock that lost or gained even a few seconds per day would, over the course of a long ocean voyage, accumulate an error large enough to throw a ship's position off by many miles. Governments recognized the severity of this problem and offered substantial prizes for its solution. The British Longitude Act of 1714 offered rewards of up to £20,000, an enormous sum for the era, for any method that could determine longitude at sea to within specified degrees of accuracy. Astronomers proposed elaborate methods involving the positions of the moon and the stars, methods that required complex calculations and the kind of clear skies that the ocean does not reliably provide. Mathematicians argued over theoretical approaches, and ships kept sailing, and ships kept missing their intended landfalls, and ships kept striking reefs that should have been safely distant, and sailors kept dying because the problem refused to yield to any of the proposed solutions. The answer came from an unlikely source, a carpenter and self-taught clockmaker from Lincolnshire named John Harrison, who spent most of his adult life solving a problem that had defeated professional astronomers and mathematicians with far better credentials and far more institutional support than he possessed. Harrison understood that the key was not astronomical observation or mathematical calculation. The key was keeping time, keeping it accurately, keeping it reliably, and keeping it through everything that a ship at sea could throw at a delicate mechanism. He built 4 chronometers over the course of several decades, each one incorporating new insights and new solutions to the problems of maintaining accuracy in a hostile marine environment. His first 3 designs used elaborate systems of linked balances and springs to compensate for the effects of motion, temperature change, and the varying pull of gravity at different latitudes. His 4th design, completed in 1759, was smaller, simpler, and more reliable than its predecessors, a watch-sized instrument that looked almost ordinary, but that kept time with astonishing consistency through conditions that destroyed lesser mechanisms. Harrison's chronometers were not just clever machines. They were portable certainty, a form of knowledge that a captain could carry in a box and consult whenever needed, confident that the reading would reflect reality rather than drift. A captain with a reliable chronometer could compare the local noon, measured by direct observation of the sun, with the time shown on the chronometer, which was set to the time at a known reference longitude, and calculate his east-west position with an accuracy that previous generations of navigators could not have imagined. Voyages became more direct. Landfalls became less accidental. Reefs became avoidable far more often than not because the ocean had become safer, but because navigators could now know where they were with a reliability that transformed the nature of ocean travel. In expedition history, few objects are as quietly dramatic as a clock that keeps its promise in a storm. The chronometer did not make the sea kind or predictable or forgiving of human error, but it made the sea legible in a way it had never been before, and that legibility changed the entire enterprise of ocean exploration from its foundations upward. Every subsequent voyage, every chart drawn, every scientific measurement made, every rescue conducted at sea benefited from the knowledge of longitude that Harrison's life work made possible. He did not discover a new continent or navigate a previously unknown passage. He solved an equation that had been killing sailors for centuries, and the solution he found was mechanical rather than mathematical, practical rather than theoretical, and it worked. But even with the chronometer solving longitude and the sextant refining latitude measurements, ocean navigation in the age of sail still relied fundamentally on a technique called dead reckoning for the periods between celestial observations, and dead reckoning had a flaw that the ocean exploited with merciless consistency. Dead reckoning feels reassuring because it uses things you can actually see and measure. Your speed through the water, estimated by watching a floating object pass alongside the hull or measured by throwing a log line overboard and counting how quickly it ran out. Your direction on the compass, checked regularly and recorded carefully, and the time elapsed since your last reliably fixed position, tracked on a ship's clock or by careful log keeping. Add all of those elements together, accounting for course changes and speed variations, and you get a calculated estimate of where you should be, a position plotted on the chart that represents your best guess based on the best information available. The ocean, however, has its own mathematics that does not appear in any navigation manual. Currents slide beneath a ship's hull like invisible rivers, pushing the vessel sideways at rates that can vary from barely perceptible to several miles per hour, depending on where in the ocean you happen to be. A crew might steer faithfully and accurately for days, maintaining a perfect compass course and careful speed estimates, only to discover when land finally appeared that the sea had been carrying them diagonally the entire time, moving them toward danger while the compass and the log told a different story. A tired sailor's speed estimate, a worn log line that gave inaccurate readings, a small but consistent steering error, any of these could compound over days and weeks into positional errors large enough to cause serious trouble. Explorers learned humility from this. The sea can be navigated, but it cannot be fully controlled. When the water moves, it moves the ship with it, and no amount of careful dead reckoning can account for currents that cannot be seen or measured from the deck. Every experienced navigator understood that dead reckoning gave you a position, not the position, and that the gap between those two things could be measured in lives. The ship's log began as a tool for discipline and accountability, a daily record of course, speed, wind, and weather that captains were required to maintain, and that could be reviewed by authorities when a voyage was complete. But over time, those logs became something far more valuable than administrative paperwork. They quietly became scientific treasure. Each day's entry demanded notes on wind direction and strength, cloud cover, sea state, temperature, and the ship's position and progress. Over months and years, those entries turned into patterns. A single captain navigating the same route repeatedly might notice seasonal shifts in wind or current. But thousands of logs from dozens of ships across decades revealed something far larger and far more significant. Where storms were common and where they were rare. Where calms lingered for weeks in certain seasons. How currents behaved in different regions and at different times of year. Where fog was most likely and where visibility could be counted on. The log also captured the human side of exploration in plain, unadorned language. Broken masts and strange lights on the horizon. Unfamiliar birds that had never been seen before in any natural history collection. The emotional weather of a crew under stress, recorded in the dry, factual language that convention demanded, but that still managed to convey something of the tension and fear beneath the surface. Later researchers learned to read these pages as data, mining them for information about historical weather patterns, ocean circulation, and the distribution of marine life. Even though the men who wrote the entries never imagined that any of this would be useful to anyone beyond the ship's owner and the port authorities. It is one of history's quiet miracles. Ordinary routine, maintained day after day with no particular expectation of lasting significance, produced a vast long-term record of the ocean's moods and behaviors. The sea changed, in the minds of those who studied these records carefully, from a collection of individual stories into a place that could be compared across time and space, mapped in ways that went beyond geography, and studied as a system with its own logic and its own patterns. Sailors learned, through generations of accumulated observation, that ocean swells can point toward land that lies far beyond the limits of human sight. Land announces itself in ways that are easy to miss if you have not been trained to notice them, and easy to dismiss as coincidence if you have not yet learned to trust them. Long before a shoreline appears on the horizon, islands can shape the water around them in detectable ways. Swells generated by distant storms travel enormous distances across open ocean, and when they encounter an island or a shallow bank, they reflect, refract, and interfere with each other in patterns that create subtle changes in the rhythm of the sea beneath the ship. The rhythm of the waves changes in ways that experienced sailors can feel through the hull, through the motion of the vessel, through the seat of their pants, or the pressure of their feet on the deck. It is a physical knowledge, built up through years of careful attention to sensations that most people never learn to notice because they have never had reason to. Near land, you might also encounter floating vegetation, coconuts, freshwater fish that do not venture far from shores, or the characteristic smell of jungle vegetation carried on the wind from an island still over the horizon. This kind of knowledge is genuinely difficult to write down in a way that conveys its full usefulness. It requires demonstration and practice and years of paying attention rather than a simple reading of a manual. It is easy to dismiss by those who have not experienced it, which is why it was often misunderstood or ignored by European navigators encountering these skills for the first time in Polynesian and Pacific Islander sailors. But in the open ocean, where the conventional instruments provide only approximations, and where every piece of additional information can tip the balance between success and disaster, this embodied, sensory knowledge is practical and powerful in ways that rival any instrument ever manufactured. The trade winds deserve special attention in any history of ocean exploration, because they were not just weather phenomena. They were the hidden architecture of the entire age of sail, the invisible highways that determined where ships could go and how quickly they could get there, and therefore where ports grew wealthy and where empires expanded. In the tropics, the global atmospheric circulation sets up remarkably reliable belts of wind that blow consistently from one direction for extended periods, interrupted by seasonal shifts, but broadly predictable in a way that allowed navigators to plan voyages with a confidence that they could not apply to higher latitudes. Sailors discovered that these trade winds could carry ships westward across the Atlantic or the Pacific with a speed and consistency that felt almost effortless once you had positioned yourself in the right latitude and set your sails. The return voyage required finding a different band of wind, the westerlies of higher latitudes, which meant sailing north or south before turning back toward home, creating the great looping routes that characterized the age of exploration and that shaped the geography of European colonial expansion. Once those patterns were understood and reliably used, exploration changed its tone and its tempo. Voyages became planned systems rather than one-off gambles, because a captain who understood the trade winds could promise to be somewhere at a particular season with a confidence that would have been impossible a century earlier. That efficiency fed expansion, and expansion fed conquest, and conquest fed the creation of colonial systems that would transform the world, often in ways that caused immeasurable suffering to the people on the receiving end. The trade winds are therefore more than weather. They are part of the hidden machinery of history, the physical mechanism that made regular transatlantic crossings possible and therefore made the regular exploitation of the Americas and Africa possible. A steady tropical breeze carries civilization's brightest ambitions and its darkest consequences in exactly equal measure, and it makes no distinction between the two. Near the equator, however, those reliable trade winds gave way to something that terrified sailors almost as much as a violent storm, but in a completely different way. The doldrums, a region of light, variable winds, and frequent dead calms near the equatorial convergence zone, could trap a sailing ship for days or weeks at a time with sails hanging slack and progress reduced to near zero. A ship could sit under a blazing equatorial sun while the sea looked smooth enough to mock any attempt to move across it. Water stores that had been fresh when packed slowly warmed and began to taste foul. Food spoiled faster in the heat. Tempers frayed. Discipline became harder to maintain with each stalled day. The psychological strain was intense, because you could see endless ocean in every direction and still feel utterly imprisoned, unable to move toward any destination no matter how desperately you wanted to. Then, without any reliable warning, violent squalls could erupt, dumping rain in quantities that could refill water casks if the crew was quick enough to catch it, but tearing at rigging and canvas with a sudden ferocity that felt almost vindictive after the oppressive calm that had preceded it. The sky changed its mind in anger, or so it seemed to sailors who had been baking in motionless heat for a week and then found themselves fighting to keep sails from being stripped away by a thunderstorm. Expeditions planned carefully around this zone, trying to cross it as quickly as possible in sections where calm periods were known to be shortest. Yet many were forced into prolonged encounters with it by bad timing, unfavorable currents, or simple misfortune. The doldrums reveal something important about ocean travel that the dramatic narratives of exploration often underplay. Danger is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is stillness. Sometimes the most threatening thing the ocean can do is simply refuse to cooperate, sitting passive and heavy and hot, while supplies dwindle and patience dissolves, and the margin between success and disaster narrows with every motionless day. For explorers who had prepared for storms and reefs and navigation challenges, learning to endure that enforced pause was as important a test of character as any battle with breaking seas. The ability to maintain discipline and purpose during periods of enforced inaction separated successful expeditions from those that fell apart under the weight of their own impatience. Scurvy was the other great killer of the age of sail, and its story is both a medical tragedy and a parable about the slow, painful progress of knowledge against the resistance of established belief. On long voyages, sailors began to fail in ways that were frightening and confusing in equal measure. Gums swelled and bled until eating became an ordeal. Old wounds that had healed cleanly reopened, as if the body were undoing its own repairs. Legs grew weak and joints ached. Exhaustion turned even simple tasks into monumental efforts. A ship could leave a home port with a strong, healthy crew and arrive at its destination with people so debilitated they could barely handle the anchor. The tragedy is that scurvy was not a mystery of monsters or curses or punishment from heaven, as some sailors believed in their darker moments. It was a nutritional collapse, driven by months without fresh sources of vitamin C, though the specific vitamin would not be identified or understood for centuries after the disease had been killing sailors in vast numbers. For most of the age of exploration, expeditions treated scurvy with superstition, resignation, or useless remedies that ranged from harmless to actively counterproductive. The sea kept collecting bodies, and expedition leaders kept accepting those deaths as an inevitable cost of doing business on the ocean, because no one had yet figured out why it happened or what could reliably prevent it. Some commanders had noticed empirically that certain foods seemed to help. Fresh fruits and vegetables, citrus juice, and fresh meat all seemed to slow the progression of the disease or prevent it from appearing at all. But without a theoretical framework to explain why, these observations did not translate reliably into policy. The connection between diet and scurvy was made and lost, and made again multiple times across different expeditions and different national traditions, because without understanding the mechanism, it was difficult to be certain that the dietary intervention was actually doing the work rather than some other factor. When effective prevention finally spread widely, it changed ocean strategy at a fundamental level. A navy or a trading company that could keep its crews healthy could sail farther, stay at sea longer, and return more reliably than one that accepted scurvy as inevitable. The ocean did not become kinder when the connection between citrus and scurvy prevention was finally acted upon. Humans simply became better prepared for one of its most predictable hazards. A simple fruit, carried in adequate quantities and rationed carefully, helped transform voyages from slow, attrition-based ordeals into sustained explorations where the human body was no longer the primary limiting factor. Captain Cook made the systematic management of crew health a priority in ways that distinguished him from almost all of his contemporaries. He treated the health of his sailors not as a matter of fate or luck, but as a problem with practical solutions that could be applied through consistent policy and regular routine. He insisted on cleanliness and ventilation aboard his ships, recognizing that the cramped, damp conditions of a vessel at sea created environments where disease spread easily and where preventable suffering was allowed to become the norm. He experimented carefully with provisions, testing foods that had shown promise in preventing the worst nutritional deficiencies and insisting on variety in the diet even when variety was expensive or inconvenient. The key was not a single miracle food or a brilliant theoretical insight. It was the application of careful observation, systematic experimentation, and disciplined routine to a problem that previous commanders had either ignored or approached haphazardly. Cook's voyages proved that the death rate from disease on long ocean expeditions was not an unalterable fact of life at sea, but rather a consequence of bad management that could be dramatically reduced through better policy. That demonstration changed what navies and expedition organizers expected of themselves and of the commanders they sent to sea. This matters for expedition history because it links exploration to logistics in a way that heroic narratives often miss. Great journeys are often won in storerooms and kitchens, in the careful counting of provisions and the systematic application of preventive measures, not only on open decks in dramatic moments of bravery. When sailors stop dying in predictable ways from diseases that careful provisioning could prevent, the map of what is possible expands. Ships can go farther. Voyages can last longer. Knowledge can accumulate more systematically. The unglamorous work of keeping people alive and functional turns out to be just as important as the glamorous work of pointing a ship toward the horizon. The Manila galleons represent one of the most dramatic examples of how ocean routes can become the physical infrastructure of a global economy. In the late 16th century, Spanish colonial power connected the Philippines and the Viceroyalty of New Spain, what is now Mexico, with a trans-Pacific trade route that carried silver eastward and silk, porcelain, and spices westward, year after year, in ships that were among the largest and most heavily laden in the world. Imagine a single sailing route operating on a regular schedule, crossing the widest ocean on Earth with one of the most valuable cargoes in the world, in each direction, sustained continuously for almost 250 years. The crossing was long and punishing. Ships departing the Philippines had to fight their way north to catch favorable winds before swinging east across the Pacific, a voyage that could take months, and that subjected crews to the same ordeals of scurvy, heat, calm, and storm that plagued every long ocean crossing. Ships departing New Spain heading west had to find a different route, dropping south to catch the trade winds before crossing to Asia, another long, grinding passage through open water. Crews faced isolation so profound and complete that it tested morale as thoroughly as any physical danger. The psychological weight of months at sea, out of sight of land, dependent on a ship's structure and provisions holding together, with no possibility of rescue or resupply if things went wrong, was a constant pressure that even experienced sailors never entirely got used to. Yet the reward was enormous. A successful voyage could reshape markets across 2 continents and fund entire governments. The silver of the Americas, mined in vast quantities by forced indigenous and African labor under conditions of terrible exploitation, flowed west across the Pacific and into Asian markets where it was eagerly sought as currency. In return, luxury goods flowed east, filling the homes of wealthy colonists and the courts of European royalty with objects of Asian craftsmanship that carried the glamour of distance and the prestige of the exotic. Ports on both ends of the route became melting pots where languages, foods, cooking techniques, plants, animals, and cultural practices mixed under the sustained pressure of profit and distance, creating hybrid cultures that were genuinely new, genuinely unprecedented, products of the ocean route as much as of any particular tradition. But ocean routes carry darker cargo too, and any honest account of the history of ocean expeditions has to face that fact directly. The Atlantic slave trade was not an expedition in any adventurous or scientific sense of the word. It was a system of organized violence that turned ocean routes into machinery for human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. People were captured, primarily in West and Central Africa, through a combination of European direct raids and the exploitation of existing African systems of captivity and sale, and then forced onto ships and carried across the Atlantic under conditions that were designed for profit rather than survival. Conditions that treated human beings as cargo to be packed as efficiently as possible and delivered to markets in the Americas. The crossing, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare that lasted weeks and that subjected enslaved people to confinement, disease, violence, hunger, thirst, and the constant psychological torment of being transported away from everything and everyone they had known toward a future of perpetual bondage. Ships became floating prisons where illness spread with devastating speed and where despair was as present as the air itself. The mortality rate was staggering. Millions of people died in the crossing, and millions more died in the raids and forced marches that preceded embarkation or in the brutal process of adaptation to plantation labor that followed arrival in the Americas. Resistance happened, in many forms and at every stage of the process. People refused to eat. They sabotaged ships. They organized uprisings at sea. even when the odds were so crushing that success must have seemed impossible, because the alternative was acceptance of a condition that no human being should have to accept. Some of these uprisings succeeded. Most did not. And those that did not were met with violence that was intended not just to suppress the immediate resistance, but to terrorize everyone who had witnessed it into submission. The legacy of the Atlantic slave trade did not end at the shoreline. It shaped economies, legal systems, political structures, and cultural identities across multiple continents. And it left wounds that are still present and still tender centuries after the formal end of the slave trade and of slavery itself. When we talk about ocean history, when we celebrate the voyages and the navigational achievements and the scientific discoveries, this crossing has to be faced honestly and prominently, not as a footnote or a caveat, but as a central fact. It shows that the same ocean that carried ideas and goods and cultural exchange also carried cruelty at industrial scale, operated by people who were perfectly capable of also being skilled navigators and competent administrators, and that the capacity for extraordinary achievement and the capacity for extraordinary evil can exist in the same civilization, operating through the same infrastructure. At the same time, remembering this clearly is not a repudiation of the genuine achievements of ocean exploration. It is a necessary part of understanding what ocean exploration actually was, and what its consequences actually included for the full range of human beings whose lives it touched. The period of great ocean exploration also produced a fascinating and morally ambiguous figure who occupied the space between legitimate naval officer and criminal opportunist. The privateer worked under a legal commission from a government that authorized attacks on enemy commerce, but the line between a licensed privateer and an outright pirate was thin enough in practice to be almost meaningless in many situations. A privateer captain operated a privately owned ship with a crew recruited and paid primarily through the prospect of prize money from captured enemy vessels and cargoes. The commission was supposed to define the limits of legitimate action. The ocean, however, was an enormous space poorly supervised by any authority, and the temptation to exceed those limits when a profitable target presented itself was not always successfully resisted. Governments issued these commissions because privateers offered a cost-effective way to attack enemy commerce without the expense of maintaining a full war fleet. A successful privateer could weaken an opponent's trade, disrupt supply lines, and capture valuable prizes, all while generating enough income from those prizes to pay the crew and turn a profit for the investors who had backed the venture. It was a business model dressed in patriotism, and it attracted men who were genuinely motivated by both the financial opportunity and the adventure, along with plenty who were primarily interested in one or the other. For the broader world of ocean expeditions, the effect of privateering was to turn trade routes into battle zones during any period of European conflict, which was most of the time. Merchant captains sailed with anxiety that no navigational skill could entirely dispel, because a fast ship flying a foreign flag could appear out of nowhere and turn a routine commercial voyage into a violent crisis with very little warning. Ports buzzed with intelligence and rumors about raiders operating in particular waters. Convoys were organized for protection. Insurance premiums reflected the elevated risk, and the constant pressure of potential attack drove improvements in ship speed, armament, and the general quality of seamanship in merchant fleets that had to be capable of either escaping or defending themselves. Privateering shaped naval strategy in important ways because it demonstrated that attacking an enemy's commerce could be a more efficient form of warfare than direct fleet engagements. You could weaken a rival power not by defeating its navy in battle, but by systematically stripping away the merchant shipping that fed its economy and provided the revenue that paid for everything else. This insight shaped European naval thinking for centuries and created careers for sailors who combined navigational skill with a willingness to operate in the morally and legally ambiguous space between war and crime. The legal and moral ambiguity of privateering was never fully resolved, partly because it was so useful to the governments that issued the commissions, and partly because the ocean was so difficult to police that the distinction between licensed predation and outright piracy tended to collapse in practice. A sailor who held a commission from one government was a criminal in the eyes of every other government, and the difference between being celebrated as a hero and hanged as a pirate often depended entirely on which side won the war and who held the power at the moment of judgment. Life aboard any ship on a long ocean voyage was a test of social cohesion under conditions that made social cohesion exceptionally difficult to maintain. A ship is a small world with no easy exit, where the same people eat and sleep and work and argue in spaces that most modern people would find claustrophobically confined for months or years at a time, with no possibility of walking away from a conflict or taking a break from people whose habits and personalities had become unbearable. When the pressures of the voyage added physical hardship, fear, inadequate food, unreasonable commanders, or broken promises about pay and conditions to the baseline stress of ordinary shipboard life, the result was sometimes a mutiny. Mutiny could begin quietly, with whispered conversations in the forward part of the ship where officers rarely went, with shared grievances that grew more articulate and more urgent with each watch, with the slow formation of agreements about what would be done and who would lead the doing of it. Or it could erupt suddenly, sparked by a specific incident, an unjust punishment, an order that seemed designed to get people killed, a discovery that provisions had been deliberately short-measured by corrupt officers. Either way, it represented the moment when the crew's collective decision overcame the individual authority of the captain, when fear of punishment stopped being a sufficient reason to obey. Some mutinies were desperate attempts to survive genuinely bad command, situations where the officers in charge were making decisions so dangerous or so incompetent that the crew calculated their chances of survival were better with different leadership than with continued obedience. Others were more straightforwardly about power and greed, about seizing control of a ship and its cargo for personal benefit. And some fell somewhere in between, motivated by a mixture of legitimate grievance and opportunism that made clean moral judgment difficult from the comfortable distance of later centuries. The aftermath could be devastating. Mutineers who were caught faced trials, imprisonment, or execution, even when their complaints about conditions or command were entirely valid and well documented. The legal structure of maritime authority was not designed to distinguish between righteous rebellion and criminal insubordination, and the people who sat in judgment were usually officers themselves, with a professional interest in maintaining the principle that sailors had to obey their commanders regardless of the quality of those commanders. Yet mutinies also forced changes, because the institutions that operated ships and organized expeditions could not entirely ignore the evidence that conditions on board were sometimes producing violent rebellions. They showed, in the most dramatic way possible, that exploration history is not only about maps and instruments and scientific discoveries. It is also about human beings under pressure, about the limits of endurance and authority, about what happens when the social structures that hold a voyage together are pushed past their breaking point. The ocean does not just test ships. It tests the people inside them. And sometimes those people find that what is being asked of them exceeds what any reasonable human being can be expected to provide. Shipwrecks are among the most haunting artifacts of ocean expedition history, and they have been revealing their secrets with increasing clarity as the technologies of underwater exploration have improved. A wreck is a time capsule sealed by cold, salt, and darkness, carrying the moment of its disaster frozen in a state of preservation that dry land almost never provides. When a ship goes down quickly, it takes with it not just its cargo, but its entire material world. The tools that were being used at the moment of impact, the personal possessions that sailors kept in their chests, the navigational instruments and charts that were being consulted when disaster struck, the provisions that remained, the coins and jewelry and trade goods that were packed in the hold. All of it settles to the bottom and begins the long, slow process of becoming part of the seabed. Over time, currents bury and uncover these fragments in cycles that can span centuries, revealing new details with each exposure and concealing others for generations. The wood of the hull may rot away while ceramics and metal objects survive for thousands of years, preserved by the cold and the low oxygen levels of deep water. Sometimes the sea preserves astonishing detail. Organic materials that would vanish within years on land can sometimes last for centuries under the right underwater conditions. Personal letters, clothing, leather goods, and wooden tools have been recovered from wrecks in conditions of preservation that make them feel immediate and close, as if the disaster had happened last season rather than 500 years ago. But wrecks are not treasure chests in the sense of adventure stories. They are often graves, and that demands a form of respect that the treasure hunting tradition of salvage diving has not always provided. The ethical questions surrounding access to and recovery from shipwrecks are genuinely complex, involving the rights of modern nations over vessels that sank in their territorial waters, the rights of the families of those who died in those wrecks, the claims of the descendant nations whose ships the wrecks represent, and the interests of the scientific community that wants to study them systematically before any disturbance destroys the contextual information that makes them scientifically valuable. The best work treats the seabed as a museum without walls, a place where the objects should be understood in their context before being removed from it, and where the human dimension of the story should be honored alongside the scientific and historical information. Each dive to a significant wreck site asks the same fundamental questions. Are we here to learn, or are we here to take? Are we honoring the people who died here, or are we treating their grave as a resource? The answers to those questions say a great deal about what we actually value when we claim to be interested in ocean exploration history. And we are now reaching the point in our story where ocean exploration begins its transformation from the age of sail to the age of science and steam, where the human relationship with the deep ocean begins to change in fundamental ways, and where the instruments and institutions that will produce modern oceanography begin to take shape. The pieces are all in place. The chronometer has solved longitude. The systematic scientific expedition has established that the deep ocean has geography and chemistry and biology worth studying. The first circumnavigation has proved that the world's oceans are one connected system. And now, as the 19th century moves into the 20th, the question is no longer whether humans can cross the ocean, but how deeply they can understand it, how far below the surface they can reach, and what they will find when they get there. The oceans had given up some of their secrets, slowly and expensively, measured in lives and years and voyages beyond counting. But the deepest mysteries were still waiting, in the cold, in the pressure, in the darkness below. And the people who would go looking for them were already building the tools they would need for the descent. After thousands of years of sailing, sounding, and suffering across every ocean on Earth, humanity finally arrived at a truth that no single expedition could have delivered alone. The ocean is not a backdrop to human history. It is the engine of it. Every voyage we have traced across this long story, from the Polynesian navigator feeling swells beneath a canoe, to the exhausted crew of the Victoria limping home after the first circumnavigation, to the scientists of the Challenger lowering lines into darkness, all of them were pieces of one enormous, unfinished question. What is this planet we live on, really? The answers came slowly and at tremendous cost. They came in the form of Harrison's chronometers and Cook's charts and Darwin's notebooks. They came in depth readings that shattered every assumption about how far down the seafloor actually sat. They came in the magnetic stripes on the ocean floor that finally confirmed plate tectonics, proving that the ground beneath the sea moves, breathes, and renews itself over millions of years in a cycle so vast it makes human civilization feel like a brief flicker. They came from hydrothermal vents, where life was found thriving in total darkness, fed by chemistry rather than sunlight, rewriting every definition of what life requires. They came from drilling cores pulled up from the seafloor that carried millions of years of climate history inside them, readable layer by layer like the pages of a diary written by the Earth itself. The ocean taught us that the planet is older, stranger, and more interconnected than anyone standing on a shore could have guessed. It taught us that exploration is never really finished, that every answer opens a corridor to 3 more questions, and that the deepest places still hold secrets that no instrument has yet reached. But the ocean is also teaching us something else now, something harder to hear. All those centuries of extraction, of treating the sea as an infinite resource, of dumping and taking and crossing without consequence, have left marks that the water cannot hide. Temperatures are rising in the deep. Coral reefs that took centuries to build are bleaching and dying in single seasons. Species that survived millions of years of natural change are disappearing within human lifetimes. The same ocean that carried Zheng He's treasure fleets and fed Rome's millions and guided Polynesian wayfinders home across 2,000 miles of open water, is now asking a question back at us. What will you do with everything you have learned? Every expedition in this story was driven by some form of desire. For profit, for knowledge, for power, for survival, for the simple and irresistible pull of wanting to know what lies beyond the horizon. That desire is not wrong. It is one of the finest things about us. But desire without responsibility is how reefs become rubble, and how fisheries collapse, and how the most complex ecosystem on Earth becomes a place of loss instead of wonder. The explorers who came before us paid extraordinary prices to understand this ocean. They paid in years and comfort and health and sometimes in their lives. The least we can do with what they earned is use it wisely. The story of ocean expeditions is not over. It is not even close to over. There are more species unknown in the deep sea than have been cataloged in all the world's rainforests combined. There are seafloor mountain ranges longer than any on land that no human eye has ever directly seen. There are currents and chemistry and biological systems we are only beginning to understand, systems that regulate the climate and the air and the very conditions that make human life on this planet possible. The next chapter of ocean exploration will be written by people who understand both the wonder and the weight of what came before, who know that the sea is not a problem to be solved or a resource to be emptied, but a living system to be understood, respected, and, after everything it has given us across all these thousands of years, protected. The horizon is still there. It always will be. And the ocean is still full of questions worth sailing toward. That is where our story ends, and where the next one begins.